In our last lecture, we arrived at a basic definition of the novel, identifying it as a long work of prose fiction. We also considered some of the distinctions between novels and other literary forms, focusing on the novel's commitment to realism and particularity. In this lecture, we'll refine our understanding of the novel form. The lecture will have two main parts. In the first part, we'll identify the novel as a form with two major dimensions, one sociological, the other psychological. The relationship between these dimensions is often especially important to authors and readers of novels. In the second part of the lecture, we'll ask ourselves what, if anything, distinguishes the English novel from other national traditions. Are there themes or structures that tend to recur in English novels? And if so, what are they? Let's start by considering the sociological and psychological dimensions of the novel. Novelists tend to be interested in, make that obsessed with, social distinctions, social hierarchies, and social values. They're especially attentive to issues of social status. Who in this particular social world is really and truly esteemed? How do people move up and down the social ladder? What really matters to those people, and why? In approaching such questions, we must remember that status is not simply a matter of economics. There's more to it than just your income or your fortune. Indeed, a wide range of factors help to determine your status. Such factors might include your family background, your level of education, and your occupation. They might also include your race, ethnicity, sex, and sexual orientation. Your religion might be a factor, and so might your politics. Personal qualities like native intelligence or a good sense of humor might also belong on the list. So you can see that it really does go beyond your bank balance. Novelists noticed these things long before they were codified by sociologists, at least that's my opinion. And novelists also noticed the social phenomenon later labeled as status incongruence. That's the possibility of conflict or tension among different factors in the status equation. What do we do, for example, with a person from a good family, high status, with a good education, high status again, who can't seem to hold down a job? How much of her or his original high status is compromised by personal shortcomings? This is the very sort of question that fires the novelistic imagination. Such questions may be approached in a variety of ways. Many novelists prefer a very narrow focus, concentrating on a small social group, such as a family or the residents of a small town. Here, the paradigm case might be Jane Austen, author of Pride and Prejudice and Emma, who once remarked that 3 or 4 country families were just the thing for a novelist to work on. Austen's casts are limited, and most of her characters are already quite familiar with each other by the time the main action begins. In this situation, subtle distinctions and discriminations in status might be especially meaningful. Other novels take advantage of the form's length, drawing in dozens of characters and moving from the top to the bottom of the social ladder. These novels may seem to describe an entire society, exploring relations among whole classes of people. A good example here might be Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray, published in monthly installments during 1847 and 1848. Thackeray's cast is enormous. In sharp distinction to Austen, with her 3 or 4 country families, Thackeray gives us about 60 different characters. To be sure, they're not all equally important, but the sheer profusion of people, of characters in a novel like Vanity Fair is nevertheless quite striking. Thackeray's cast also ranges widely. The group includes aristocrats, military officers, clergymen, businessmen, bohemian artists, and servants. Thackeray's people may not even know each other, but we know them all and see the sometimes obscure connections among them. Indeed, novels like Vanity Fair seem designed to make the sociological point that status is relational. One group rises or falls depending on its perceived differences from other groups. Thus, as a group, aristocrats outrank businessmen, physicians, or lawyers. There's an important distinction in this period, one perhaps especially important to our understanding of the 18th and 19th centuries, between someone who is, as we might now say, independently wealthy and someone who still has to work for a living. Technically, only those in the former category qualify as English gentlemen. You're not a gentleman if you hold down a job, if you're drawing up salary. Now, within any particular group, there may be further and finer distinctions. Here, we might think of the hierarchies within the military, the church, or, why not admit it, the academy. Since the hierarchies and ranks of the English aristocracy are always a matter of potential confusion, especially for American readers, we should probably take a moment to clarify them. Perhaps the first point to make is that the ranks of the aristocracy have grown over the centuries. As Queen Elizabeth ended her reign at the beginning of the 17th century, there were about 50 English peers. By 1641, there were more than 130 of them. In that short time, a number of new titles, and indeed an entirely new rank, the baronetcy, had been created by James I. Bringing things up to date, we might note that in 1993 there were more than 1,000 peers. About 750 of them held hereditary peerages, meaning that the title would be passed down to their children, while about 350 held what is called a life peerage. Life peerages are granted to a person for the course of his or her own life, but can't be passed along after death. A second crucial point deserves mention. Not all aristocrats are created equal. At the very top, of course, are the king and queen. After that, it can get tricky. Does a duke outrank an earl or a baron, for example? The answer to that question is yes. A duke outranks everyone but the royals. Following the rank of duke, we have, in order, the ranks of marquess, earl, viscount, baron, and baronet. Applying the point to Thackeray's novel, we might note that his highest-ranking aristocrat, Lord Steyne, is a marquess. He holds over 12 titles, and as they're listed, the very existence of the aristocracy begins to seem more and more ridiculous. The narrator tells us that Steyne is the Most Honorable George Gustavus, Marquess of Steyne, Earl of Gaunt and of Gaunt Castle in the Peerage of Ireland. And here I might just pause to note that there was a separate Scottish peerage, independent of the English peerage, up to 1707, and a separate Irish peerage up to 1801. After that, the Irish peerage was limited, though not enough, obviously, to cut out Thackeray's Lord Steyne. Returning and completing the list of titles, we have Viscount Helborough, Baron Pytchley and Grilsby, a knight of the most noble order of the Garter. These are all titles for one person. Of the Golden Fleece of Spain, of the Russian Order of St. Nicholas of the First Class, of the Turkish Order of the Crescent, First Lord of the Powder Closet and Groom of the Back Stairs. And now it starts sounding like something out of Monty Python. But we're not finished. Colonel of the Gaunt, or regent's own regiment of militia, a trustee of the British Museum, an elder brother of the Trinity House, a governor of the Whitefriars, and DCL. In case you're curious, DCL means Doctor of Civil Law. So as we see in that passage, the English are perfectly capable of making fun of their own aristocracy. Indeed, they do it better than just about anyone else. So if you run across an aristocrat, either in your reading or in life, don't assume that his fellow Englishmen and women necessarily hold him in awe. In addition to exploring various sociological issues, novelists also delve into human psychology, providing vivid images of how individuals think and feel. The novel may be uniquely suited to this task. Plays and films are often forced to concentrate on externals, so how a person moves or how he speaks or how he dresses. A novel, by contrast, is free to probe the innermost recesses of both head and heart. Some of the most important scenes in the novel may involve no dialogue at all. In such scenes, a character may be sitting quietly, reflecting on her own feelings. If you came upon that scene in real life, you might assume that nothing much was happening. The person's just sitting eating lunch. But if you found the same scene in a novel, you'd instantly recognize the richness and complexity of that other person's thoughts. Ideas, feelings, sense impressions, memories, predictions. You might see all of these things and more swirling around in that person's head. To show you what I mean and to suggest the continuing vitality of the novel tradition, let me show you a fascinating example from a very recent English novel. This work is called Saturday. It was written by an author named Ian McEwan and published in 2005. Now, as the title suggests, Saturday takes place on a single day. And it's not just any day, but rather the day back in 2003 when Londoners took to the streets urging the Blair government to stay out of the impending war with Iraq. The central character is Henry Perrown, a middle-aged neurosurgeon. Perrown is usually on the left politically, but this time he's not so sure. Recently, in the course of his medical practice, he's treated an Iraqi expatriate, a professor who's still suffering the after effects of torture at the hands of Saddam Hussein's regime. As we move through this passage, we see Perrown examine the question of the war from all sides. The marchers could be right, he concedes, but then again, they seem awfully self-righteous. And here's the passage in full. Perrown knows that when a powerful imperium, Assyrian, Roman, American, makes war and claims just cause, history will not be impressed. Now let's stop there and take a look at that opening sentence. Perrown knows. So one of the things that's moving through this passage and moving through his head is his knowledge specifically of history. We see in this opening sentence that he's capable of viewing these immediate events and his own feelings and responses to those events from a kind of historical perspective. So he's right there in the middle of this situation. He's all sort of mixed up about it. And yet he's also sort of outside the situation at the same time, imagining what the historians will say about it, maybe even centuries later. So there's a kind of double consciousness at work in this passage that's very, very interesting, and that's evident right from the start. Now let me show you what I mean by reading that opening sentence again. Perrown knows, knowledge, that when a powerful imperium, Assyrian, Roman, American, so we just move through these historical periods, Assyrian, Roman, American, makes war and claims just cause, history will not be impressed. He also worries that the invasion or the occupation will be a mess. The marchers could be right. So in the first part of this passage, we see him weighing the arguments presented by the marchers and acknowledging the justice, the rightness of those arguments. The marchers could be right. He doesn't know for sure. He has this historical perspective, but on the other hand, he's able to concede that the marchers may have a point as well. And he acknowledges, the passage goes on, he acknowledges the accidental nature of opinions. If he hadn't met and admired the professor, he might have thought differently, less ambivalently, about the coming war. So let's stop and think about that for a moment. A chance meeting with a person can change the way you think about political events. It's all an accident. You think what you think about the war, about the protest, because of who you've met. He goes on to consider this point a little more carefully. Opinions are a roll of the dice, the narrator tells us. Opinions are a roll of the dice. By definition, none of the people now milling around Warren Street tube station happens to have been tortured by the regime, or knows and loves people who have, or even knows much about the place at all. And here in this sentence, we sense a kind of growing frustration or anger on Perrown's part. He knows more about the situation in Iraq because he's had this accidental chance encounter with the professor than these protesters do. So why are they so certain that they're right? How can they be so certain that they're right? Passage continues. It's likely most of them barely registered the massacres in Kurdish Iraq or in the Shiite South, and now they find that they care with a passion for Iraqi lives. So in that sentence, we see that Perrown really knows what he's talking about. He's read up on the situation in Iraq. He remembers these events in a way that the protesters may not. They have good reasons for their views, the passage says. So again, we're accommodating, we're qualifying, among which are concerns for their own safety. Al-Qaeda, it's said, which loathes both godless Saddam and the Shiite opposition, will be provoked by an attack on Iraq into revenge on the soft cities of the West. Now, in that sentence, I think the key phrase is, it's said. This is an opinion. This is a speculation. This is a hypothesis. We don't really know much about Al-Qaeda. We don't really know much about what they might do. We have a right to be afraid of what could happen, but we can't claim that this is knowledge. And here is how the passage wraps up. Self-interest is a decent enough cause, but Perrown can't feel, as the marchers themselves probably can. He can't feel. At the beginning he was thinking, now he's feeling. As the marchers themselves probably can. He's not even sure that he knows what they're feeling. He's not sure that he wants to go that far and attribute motives and feelings to them. Perrown can't feel, as the marchers themselves probably can, that they have an exclusive hold on moral discernment. And let's just pick apart that last phrase, because I think it's important too. An exclusive hold on moral discernment. How could you possibly think that you had such a hold, that you were the one of all people who know exactly what's right? That's the question that Perrown is sort of dealing with through this entire passage. And he comes down in a place of insecurity, I suppose, and a place of uncertainty too, but also in a kind of admirable place. He's refusing to pretend that he's more certain than he really is or can be at this moment. In this passage, just to say one more thing about it, because I think that it's a wonderful example, we see the impress, the impact of historical events on the individual human being. Here's the Iraq War. Here's the protest against that war. And here's one person, a neurosurgeon in London. How do these two things interact with each other? What are the results of that interaction? Now, if you saw Perrown going about his business on that Saturday, and during the course of the novel he gets up, makes breakfast, meets a friend for a racquetball game, and goes to the fish market, you'd have no idea that any of this was occurring to him. And that really is what the psychological dimension of the novel does for you. That's really what I hope we can see in this passage. It gives you some sense of how other people think and feel. Indeed, it helps you to imagine what it might be like to be someone else. One final point might be noted here. First, McEwan is typically novelistic in his emphasis on complexity and his interest in the accidental nature of opinions. The novelist is often less interested in taking a side, pro-war, anti-war, or whatever, than in exploring all sides of a fictional situation. Though we've considered them separately, the sociological and psychological dimensions of a novel are actually quite closely related. Indeed, one of the novel's defining features is its close attention to the relationship between society and the self or the individual. Novelist Jane Smiley puts it well when she describes the form as being, quote, first and foremost about how individuals fit or don't fit into their social worlds. Here again, McEwan's neurosurgeon Henry Perrown makes a good example. In many ways, as an educated man in a high-status profession, he's a perfect fit for his social world. In other ways, he may be something of a misfit, less active, more reflective than many of his peers. Having described the novel as a form, preoccupied with the relationship between self and society, we're ready to move on to the second part of this lecture. Here we'll consider some of the distinctive features of the English novel tradition. Perhaps the most obvious of these features is the English novel's obsession with courtship, love, and marriage. Almost all of the greatest English novels of the 18th and 19th centuries are love stories. Love and marriage also loom large in the novels of the 20th century, dominating modernist classics like Sons and Lovers by D.H. Lawrence, Ulysses by James Joyce, and To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. Now, this is really quite unusual. Many major works in other traditions are not best described as love stories. You wouldn't apply that label to a Russian novel like Brothers Karamazov or an American classic like Moby Dick. Even more important to the English tradition, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, is its striking preference for comedic endings. Comedic endings are indeed happy endings, but there's more to them than meets the eye. In comedic endings, characters find a place in the social order, and a sense of harmony and reconciliation is achieved. What's more, a sense of poetic justice prevails, as virtue is rewarded and vice is punished. To sum up, then, comedic endings offer us a vision of the world as well-ordered and sympathetic to human needs and desires. A comedic ending helps us to feel that we can get what we want, need, and deserve out of this world. Taken together, the dominance of the courtship plot and the comedic ending account for much of what we might call the Englishness of the English novel tradition. To extend this point, let's consider two classic 19th century novels, one from France, the other from England. Both novels center on the life of a writer, so this comparison is appropriate. The first of these novels is Lost Illusions by Honoré de Balzac, which appeared from 1837 to 1843. Balzac is among the greatest of all French novelists. He wrote for 14 to 16 hours a day, fueling himself with cup after cup of strong black coffee. Balzac's major achievement was a collection of novels and stories, there were about 90 of them in all, known collectively as the human comedy. In choosing that title, he's setting up a contrast and also making a connection between his work and Dante's Divine Comedy. Lost Illusions is one of the most important works in the human comedy. It concerns a young man from the provinces who has come to Paris seeking success as a poet. In our passage, he'll be described ironically as the great man of the provinces. This young man is eventually taken to a bookshop that doubles as the office of a powerful publisher, and it's there that his illusions about literature are lost. In the bookstore, he sees how the business works and realizes that you can't succeed in that business without humbling and even prostituting yourself. As we go through the passage, please be on the lookout for words like politician, celebrities, and money. At first, such words may seem to be opposed to other words in the passage, like author, literature, and poet. Balzac's aim here is to question that opposition, to suggest that authors are and have to be politicians. So here's the passage. These thoughts made his blood boil. He saw first one timid young man, and then another, penurious authors wanting to speak to Doriat. Seeing that the shop was crowded, they went off, saying, I will come back later, despairing of being able to have a word with him. 2 or 3 politicians, surrounded by a group of political celebrities, were talking about the convocation of the chambers and public affairs. And with every phrase, Doriat rose in Lucien's estimation, as he saw how politics and literature converged upon that shop. There he had seen a distinguished poet prostituting his muse to journalism. There he had seen him humiliate his art, as womanhood was humiliated and prostituted in these ignoble galleries. The great man of the provinces had taken to heart the terrible lesson: money. That was the answer to all riddles. Having found this answer and learned this lesson, the provincial poet soon abandons literature for journalism, becoming an influential critic and editorialist. Eventually, his whole career, his whole life falls apart. His mistress dies, and his friends and family are nearly ruined by his own financial collapse. It's not a particularly happy ending. Balzac's point is not that Lucien should have held fast to his original ideals, but rather that idealism itself is dangerous. Idealism sets you up for a fall, confuses your sense of how the world works. Maybe it's better to be disillusioned and even cynical, Balzac suggests, than to be starry-eyed and vulnerable. Things are very different in our second novel, the English novel, David Copperfield, by the Victorian writer Charles Dickens. David Copperfield appeared in monthly installments through 1849 and 1850. In the following passage, we listen as David describes his first great success as a writer. Please note that he attributes that success not to talent or even to luck, but rather to hard work. I worked early and late, patiently and hard, David says. I wrote a story with a purpose growing not remotely out of my experience, and sent it to Traddles, and he arranged for its publication very advantageously for me. And the tidings of my growing reputation began to reach me from travelers whom I encountered by chance. After some rest and change, I fell to work in my old ardent way, on a new fancy which took strong possession of me. As I advanced in the execution of this task, I felt it more and roused my utmost energies to do it well. This was my third work of fiction. It was not half written when, in an interval of rest, I thought of returning home. Unlike the central figure in Lost Illusions, and unlike Dickens himself, David refuses to negotiate with publishers and pays no attention to reviewers. He's devoted exclusively to his art. At the end of the passage, he's returning home not to be lionized, but rather to marry his childhood sweetheart. He loves literature, to be sure, but he loves her even more. The differences between these passages and these endings could not be more striking. In Balzac, courtship and love are minor concerns. The real focus is on the choice of a vocation or profession. In Dickens, the emphasis is reversed. Work is rewarding and important, but not as much as marriage. In Balzac, the central character is destroyed by his pursuit of fortune and fame. In Dickens, the hero emerges triumphant. The difference in these endings suggests the larger differences between these two novel traditions. In the French novel, society usually overwhelms and undermines the individual. Hard work and self-discipline are simply not enough to ensure success. In the English novel, society somehow provides for the hero. The world of David Copperfield, though not without its difficulties, is finally a hospitable and satisfying world. In closing this lecture, we might look ahead to some upcoming lectures. The lectures in our first series will cover a period of about 130 years, ending with the death of Dickens in 1870. We'll start by considering the origins or rise of the novel in the middle of the 18th century. Our focus will be on two strikingly different figures, Samuel Richardson and Henry Fielding. Despite their many differences, these two writers have much in common, including their interest in courtship and marriage and their use of comedic endings. In subsequent lectures, we'll consider the emergence of several different kinds of novels. In thinking about the work of Anne Radcliffe, we'll look at the Gothic novel, which was enormously popular from the 1790s to the 1820s. In thinking about Sir Walter Scott, we'll look at the historical novel, which shares a number of concerns with the Gothic novel, but emerges at a somewhat later period, appearing in the 18-teens and gaining enormous prestige through the following decades. In thinking about Dickens, Thackeray, and George Eliot, we'll look at the multiplot novel. In a multiplot novel, instead of following a single character through the entire story, we may shift between clusters of characters. The multiplot novel is a mid-Victorian phenomenon appearing from the 1840s to the 1870s. By the time we get to 1870, we'll begin to see some testing of limits, as writers like Thackeray, Dickens, and Emily Bronte work to complicate the conventional comedic ending. The historical context of early English fiction will be our most immediate concern, however, as well as the subject of the next lecture in this first